dialectic is about. This is why we need each other so much, is like, I can't know everything I'm supposed to know. I can't experience everything I'm supposed to experience without you. This is one reason why I suggest that the Platonic Socrates was so against writing.
Mm.
Is he says in Gorgias, I think, is what happens to the soul, like, once, when you're reading something, you don't have the author there with you
Mm-hmm.
to critique you for reading it incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
So you leave. Oh, he has a great quote here. I'm going to mess it up, but he says something like, you leave with a semblance of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you think you got out of it what you were supposed to,
Mm-hmm.
but you have no way of knowing that without the other. You need the other there to,
So
like,
this,
actually, like, help you get to where your soul needs to get.
so I've been thinking this the whole time you're talking. That's beautiful. That is so beautiful. And I think it for me that is this. There's a few different aspects of it. Well, on one level, it's the tyranny of the propositional over the
Yes.
participatory,
Ooh, good.
because the participatory comes first, and then the procedural, and then the perspectival, and then the procedural, and then the propositional. And it is that way, and it is ontologically that way, because the autopoetic system exists before the abstract propositional,
Mm,
right? In the progression of being, the you know the proposition is always dependent upon the lower order structures. And to the degree that it tries to contain the lower structures, thereby it limits reality. It inverts the pyramid, right?
mm,
If you imagine the hierarchy of being and the propositional, the the ability to know being, the ability to be in connectedness to the thing in itself, in proper relationship to, is a hierarchy that is like this. And when you make the propositional the fundamental level of reality, when you philosophize about philosophy, right? You literally create this as now your foundation. And because it's only this big, it can only pick up different aspects of these ones below it, right? But then it has to try, and then it's trying to build on top of those. And all of this starts to fall away. And then all of this is a lie. And this is the
yes.
Tower of Babel. This is the Tower of
Yes.
Babel versus Mount Analog. Hello, and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. In this adventure, I am joined by Kyle Mcnease. I encountered Kyle through his interview, which I will link to in the description, with Karen Wong on the Meaning Code YouTube channel. Kyle shared beautifully about his personal confrontations and contemplation with suffering, which has been immense. Suffering is one of the chief interests of all humanity, especially the why and how to relate. In this conversation, we assume the context of Kyle's story and range widely over the mountain, pausing to look through the lens of suffering at so many different aspects of life. This is part one of two, the second of which will be posted soon. Thank you, and as always, if you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. So I saw you on Karen Wong's channel, and um, as I mentioned in the email that I sent you and the comment on that video, your story struck me very deeply, and I was very excited to get to talk to you. Um, my From my standpoint, I have a lot of um, experience with suffering from the point of a person trying to care for the person suffering.
Right.
And from that perspective, I've spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around it and try to use it as a portal into understanding being a little bit. And so, but in my own personal life, I've had, compared to what a lot of other people go through, I've had relatively minimal suffering. Um, and so I'm hoping that we can kind of you can teach me some of the ways in which maybe I have um, decent and just how our conceptual mapping around this whole kind of central issue of humanity, how it reveals itself. So that's kind of my goal here.
That's awesome. Wow. And look, I'm super excited to be here with you. Anyone that could watch that video and and want to have a conversation, there's something to be said for that. So yeah, it's not, it's hard to monetize these kinds of conversations, but I will just say that at the outset, this is just worth noting. Just an observation. And in watching your videos, and there's this subaltern that is slowly sort of working its way up to the surface. And you know what? It gives me great hope and confidence that all is not lost.
Mm,
Because if you go back to the early Enlightenment, there's a fabulous little TED talk that I think Stephen Johnson gives about how the Enlightenment began. And he does a tour of coffee shops there. So if you just think about the switch that happened in Europe, where people are walking around a majority of the time inebriated, various states of intoxication, and suddenly there's a slight removal of the amount of alcohol that they're drinking, but there's an ingestion of caffeine, and suddenly these ideas start sparking. But where a lot of the kind of dangerous, interesting conversations were happening were in these coffee tea houses, where he sort of described it as, this is where ideas went to have sex. This is where the
mm,
ideas procreated, and nothing was off limits in terms of exploration. And so what I've noted is, like, there's just what we're calling this little corner of the internet. There are so many of these really intricate conversations starting to happen that, I mean, if you had asked me even a year ago, how many people outside of PhD programs would be walking around saying interjective or salience landscape or affordances, I'd have been like, there's a narrow slice, right? But
totally.
the vocabulary, the grammar of the game it's being elevated, and so we're leveling up. And I'm telling you, man, I'm super excited about where things are, just because I think our generation is starting to kind of get involved in that conversation. People are starting to hear our voices a little bit, and it is a little bit like the children we were talking about earlier. Like, it's an amalgamation of these great people that we admire plus our own spin on it. And so, yeah, let's spin this thing and see what we can come up with.
Totally. Totally. I love, yeah, I see it very similarly. As there's a lot of the analogy that I will use for this kind of thing is like a nodal network
Mm,
and running of code. And I think of ideas as kind of being that way, that really one of the primary functions, especially from an evolutionary standpoint, that we serve as human beings is nodes upon which ideas play out. So kind of
mm,
hyper jump the process of development, right? And there's this way in which ideas run out towards their conclusions depending on how much attention they're paid, something like that. And there's a way in which we've run some of these ideas out to their conclusion and hit some dead ends, and people are starting to realize, like, that's a dead end. You don't want to go that way, and starting to look for something new. And so maybe the light shines, a beacon shines in the darkness, something like that.
I think so. And that's a beautiful analogy for where I think we are. As so many people are writing about the terminal stages of Western civilization. I will admit that I wax. uh, I have my own terminal thoughts about our society at times, especially during the pandemic, where I just knew, based on my experience with isolation, people were going to lose it, because
Mm,
that's not the kind of animal that we are.
totally.
So you see this sort of growing mismatch between, to pull from what you're talking about with evolution, like our genetic endowment has largely gone unchanged for tens of thousands of years, but our native environment that we find ourselves in now is so radically different that renegotiating what some of this stuff even means is going to be critical. But let me tell you, you have skin in the game now. You and I, we can't afford to say, oh, well, then we're just a decadent society and it's okay for us to get sclerotic and let it all go to hell. No, man. I mean, we have a responsibility to vouchsafe to the little lives we're responsible for. At least the minimum we could give them is what we had.
Yeah.
Prior generations, people be like, "Oh, I want my kid to have everything I didn't have," and I'm telling my wife, I'm like, "I just want my kid not to get shot at school. Like, is that too much to ask? Like, we should at
Yeah.
least be able to vouchsafe to them the minimum of what we had." And
Yeah.
so, I'm excited, and yeah, wherever you want to take it, let's go, man. Don't.
There's so many places that I want to jump off with that. And maybe it will come around because I love talking about. I will just say really quickly, um, something that I've been working with in that space with it's very easy to go the doomer optimist route. And
Yeah.
because there are so many ways in which the way that things have been done and the way that we're used to things going, that's going away. And I think that is kind of inevitable in some way, but I'm trying to hold in my attention um, a greater sense of how much better things are now in a lot of ways than they have ever been, because
Ooh.
it's often very easy, especially when I've moved into some spaces where I'm seeing patterns on a different level than I used to, and it's so easy to come up with here's where this is going south and here's where we're like totally upside down over here, and we've told so many lies that we just don't know where we are anymore, those kinds of things. And then it just and this too and this too somehow is beautiful and wonderful and it's taking us somewhere, but also here we are doing this thing and this awakening thing that we've talking about is happening, and so there's a way in which maybe we're you know sacrifice is an idea that runs deep, that we've sacrificed a lot to get to a place where we can do some kind of change about what it means to be human.
Ooh, man, that is.
I'm going a little bit far there, but
No, no, no. Look, hey, the preliminary stages are now over. Let's get in. No, I think that's great. You know, oh, geez. I mean, I really do. So I taught John Vervaeke, he knows this. I told him like when in my clinical training, one of the things we had to do, and it was so onerous for me. I mention it every chance I get because you'll hear me what sounds like vacillating between saying feeling and I think. And perhaps sometimes I use that interchangeably and I equivocate where I shouldn't. But one thing I will say about clinical training where you're forced to do things like process recordings where you have to watch yourself back. It's like clinical pornography gone wrong. It's like no one wants to see themselves in that setting. And the thing that we would have to do is like we had to transcribe it. We couldn't like pawn it off on someone else. So hour long
oh,
each session of talking back and forth. But on each side of the paper is like what you said, what the client said, what you felt, what you thought, and a reflection. Why did you say the thing that you did? And the idea was trying to get you habituated to, is there something in your own life that this is bringing up, and without you even recognizing it, you're sort of like backing away from that, the conversation going in that direction. So you immediately go to, well, let's focus on cognitive behavioral therapy aimed at cognitive distortions rather than being like, you know what, if I'm being honest, that is incredibly overwhelming even as I'm hearing it right now, so I can't imagine how you must feel.
mm,
So my own, I felt that deep, and yours and Steve's conversation was one where, I mean, there's so many things you could unpack from that, but one thing that I took away from it was this that we're doing now, I'm terrible at. And just a funny story. My wife and I were talking about this yesterday about how my supervisor told me one time in clinic, he was like, notice yourself when you're really in it with a client. He's like, it's like a dance. And he's like, you'll find yourself leaning in. It's like, oh God, this is really intense. And then but you're interested. And then sometimes it's like, oh, this is really intense. And you can't get further away from them in your chair. Like it's a very physiological thing that you find yourself doing, is kind of like leaning and moving back, kind of resituating yourself in your chair. And I kid you not, like for whatever reason, um, my phone was not set to any of this. It's like connected to our automobiles, the like intercom. And so I was saying, I was like, Charlie Mann told me one time that it was like a dance when you're having these moments that are completely resonant. The other person's
Mm-hmm.
pulling and pushing you, and you're with them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that one day that'll be something that we can measure, is to the extent that a therapeutic encounter was beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be bi-directional, and it'll be something you could measure on some level, like what was the level of resonance within this. And so I was like, it's this beautiful resonant dance. And for some reason my my phone cut on and it started playing John Coltrane. um and so it was just this beautiful like dance, I mean like very intimate dance music. I just kind of looked at her and I was like, what does that mean? I don't know. But
That's awesome.
yeah, you guys got, I mean, you were plumbing the depths of many different things there, which had me intrigued to just, I was like, okay, these guys are going deep. um so yeah, let's think about how, yeah, we can just have an I thou.
Mm-hmm.
That I, again, I'm just so terrible at this format, because I really need to be in person. I need,
Sure.
that's, there's so many subtle cues that you can't, because even right now as I'm talking to you, my camera is like literally right here. So I'm not
Yeah.
even like looking at you in the eyes. I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
my eyes are crossed. I'm trying to look at you here. It's
Yeah.
just, there's so many things that are in our way.
Yeah.
And that is a metaphor that maybe we can unpack, because I think that it's an idea I've been working on for probably about 2 years, about um, light pollution, and
Mm.
it as a metaphor for many other things, but we'll get there hopefully.
Yeah, man,
So
I could run with that one.
go for
Like
it.
there's a way in which the our ourselves as existential creatures are bound up in each other. Like we know ourselves in the reflection of the other.
Hmm.
Um, and so in order to get to the point that there's more reveal, that in this kind of like mutual revealing that happens in a real relationship, the the lifeblood of that is the ability to transfer data, right? Communication, transfer data on a pure wavelength, which requires so many things. It requires trust and honesty and so many different things. But like being in person, like you said, the data transfer is so much richer. The
Yeah,
connection is so much richer that it is literally a an added filter, or significant added filters to go
significant.
in this space.
Yeah, significant. And in information comms research, we would, you can, these are measurable effects. We would call these like media rich environments versus cues filtered out. And it isn't about the bifurcation between, I'm not having a conversation about the matrix versus the real. Like that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying
Mhm.
that there is something that it means to be a human. Like we need some base level facts here that we can build off of.
Mhm.
And if you tell me that no, it's just that we are performers of multiple identities. I'm
Mm,
going to go with you and I'm going to say, of course, that's true. Sure. I'm a
mhm,
son. I'm a husband. I'm a brother. I'm a father. I'm a son of a preacher man, whatever, you know, like the songs. But that's, those are things, those are performances, but there's still something that it's like to be the human animal.
mm,
And I don't say animal pejoratively.
mm,
I don't understand what is happening. And I just love, I want to say that from the beginning. When you talk about being and Dasein, and I cannot understand what the current trajectory is about, because it seems to be something about denying fundamentally what it means to be a human.
mm,
And you
mhm,
have people like Bruno Latour, who I admire, I love his work, but like We Were Never Modern. You have people like Donna Haraway, like we've always been cyborgs. And I'm just gonna call foul. I'm just get in the penalty box for 5 minutes. I love the idea,
mhm,
but the way that it plays itself out in the world is just, it's erroneous,
mhm,
because we're taking sort of after Darwin, you get a movement away from what had been a relatively fixed definition of what it means to be human.
mhm,
And now we start to get into, well, the really the only limit is the one that you decide to put on yourself. Because what's the definition of a human? Definition of a human is one who aspires to be more than a human. But
mm,
I mean, even that is a circular. I mean, like we're getting tautologies already. Like,
mhm,
well, we need to know what it means to be a human to know what it means to transcend being a human. Like,
mm,
but you work in a very empirical way with,
mhm,
like, hey man, if you got QT prolongation, there's something that it means to die. Like there's some,
mhm,
like
mhm,
we need these parameters to be within a normal range. What do you mean by normal? I mean, within the range that a human being can function in properly. Wait a minute. What do you, I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation is just, it's fascinating that we've been led down some path. And I think there's just so many different forces at play that it's hard to disentangle and say, where did this thread originally begin? But like the sort of perfectibility of man, we can go back and we can start with, you know, the threads. You have people like Jordan Peterson who talk about the role of the alchemist. Well, you know, Bacon, Francis Bacon, people don't read this guy enough anymore. Um, but I had this wonderful opportunity to study with a Bacon scholar. We're not
cool.
talking about the Canadian Bacon here. We're talking about the real deal. Like,
That's
and
awesome.
one thing that he was very passionate about was, you know, as a sort of novel empiricist, his objective was not empire in the way that we think of like colonizing
Mm,
it. And I'm welcome the pushback about, look, I'm not a colonialist, but
sure, sure.
people need to understand the fact that what he was talking about was an empire of light, an
Mm,
empire of knowledge. It was epistemic. That's what he was
mm,
after. He's like, we're engaged in an epistemic empire. And the reason for this was, at the time there were two sort of variants here about what it meant to be a human and what it meant to be a human after the fall.
mm,
And so Bacon sort of said, hey, there's this salvific part
mhm,
that's God's business. You got to get your soul right with him, but that's between you and God. But then there's this interesting bit that's on human agency. I'm not saying he's
mm,
right or wrong. I'm saying this is what happened. He says, what happened to Adam in the garden is that one of the gifts that was bestowed upon him was on the encyclopedic knowledge.
Mm.
He had the ability to call each thing by its proper name.
Mm-hmm.
So he had this encyclopedic knowledge that Bacon thought was lost, literally. That
Oh.
that data bank,
Oh,
what like
interesting. Interesting. Okay.
an
Okay.
error script started running. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like from that moment forward, humans are losing this encyclopedic knowledge. They're losing contact with
Mm.
this sort of generous, um, bountiful ability to, in each moment, know what was needed and call a thing properly by its name, which is to say, not lying. It's to tell the truth. It's to know the thing for what it is, to call it that thing.
Yeah.
That's
And
sort
to
of part
be
of the.
and
Sorry,
to
go ahead.
be conformed to it, not just to call it,
Yeah, yeah.
but to be
To
in
be
this
in
space.
relationship. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
where it
yeah.
is fully like it fully presents itself to you as it is.
That's right. Very well said. Yes, yes. And that you can't, it like you can't disengage from the process of, when you properly perceive something, it necessarily means it's changing you, because it's your brain that's doing the actual work, the seeing. And so,
Mm-hmm.
like, even us having this conversation, whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, we're not going to be the same. Our
Mm-hmm.
timeline
Mm-hmm.
is different than would have been,
Mm-hmm.
um, but our brains are going to be different than they would have been as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the degree which that's great, that's my aim. I want
Yeah.
I want to have a great conversation where both of us get something out of it. And just
So,
going back,
oh, I'd love to jump in at some point, but let me know.
yeah, no, go ahead now.
Okay,
Yeah.
because I want to, before I lose this thread, because I think this is kind of a cool, when you're talking about Bacon's vision of these kind of two pathways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I understanding you that there's almost like a parallel
Parallel. Yeah, that's right.
of being where there's one that's this, spiritual dimension maybe, um, where it's between you and God and salvation, and then there's this other that's kind of this encyclopedic knowledge of material. Is that right?
Yeah, and that, in terms of the, it's not to say that human beings have no agency in relation to God, but the idea is there are two parts. Humanity has two problems here. We've
Mm,
lost our souls,
mm,
we've lost ourselves, but
mm,
we've also lost all of the things that we had when we were in the garden. It's not, so this is why I can't buy that it's just about like a story of us becoming self-conscious.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, because Bacon makes a profound argument that, like, wait a minute, you don't see an ape dragging its hand with a stick on a cave, and then Adam walking up and grabbing the stick from a monkey and like completing it into a piece of artwork. He's like, when he shows up on the scene, this red clay man, he's already able to hold the other,
Mm,
like he's able to like take it into himself, like
mm,
not just, as you say, like project a name onto it that doesn't belong, but like Bacon was a very fastidious observer and very engaged in nomenclature, calling a
mm,
thing by its name. I want to identify this plant, this organism, whatever it was. And so he said, hey, let's go to the new world, because perhaps the knowledge that we lost, the knowledge that we
mm,
lost is there.
mm,
And this is so, it's so staggering a thought. It's hard for me to conceive of this, but for the Greeks and where mnemonics come from, like their memory arts were such that you had the topoi, where like all the ideas that the community could talk about, that's sort of like where they existed, the topics that Aristotle writes so much about. But for a Greek person to have memory of something novel and new, dude, they had to go to another city and
mm,
experience the architecture there, because they would embed the memory in the structure. If there was a column,
mm,
they, oh, these facts, I'm going to remember that by envisioning it in this column. Like,
mm,
what do you mean? You had to go to a new place in order to member something.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so I don't know if this is like overtly a tip of the hat to that, but Bacon definitely thought that there was a way in which going to the new world, in
Mm,
some sense, is sort of it's a recovery narrative. It's how
mm,
do we get back what we lost? And one
mm,
of the things that we lost was our ability to call things by their proper name.
mm-hmm.
So to know the world as it is, I mean, like deep phenomenology here, like the thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
I know the
Mm-hmm.
thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the joy of it, right?
Yeah.
But you just, and again, you interrupt me any place here.
So I'd like to pick up on, because I'd like to propose to you that I think, and I've never interacted with this idea before, so I don't want to at all be, if this is something that I shouldn't engage with, but I'm going to make a proposal here. Um, I'm I think that Bacon is talking about two sides of the same coin. I don't think they're parallel lines. I think they're the cross, because I think that there's this aspect, and this is part of where we've diverged from reality and ended up in this strange space where we're so disconnected in the modern world, is this understanding that these things are distinct, and that and there is a distinction to be made at a certain level, because in the level of language you have to talk about things from a different side of them, right? But to the degree that I am connected to reality, to the degree that the thing in itself is what manifests in my experience of the world, and I have the ability to truly conform to my situation internally and externally, I'm also engaging in connectedness to the divine,
Hmm.
because it's in and through both of those things. So there's a way in which, to the degree that I'm like participating in the salvific journey of my soul, I'm also going to be participating in the development of knowledge in terms of the ability to be conformed to the material reality which I inhabit as well.
I look, I think that that's that's much more aligned with my own view of it.
Mm,
Um, and if somebody's citing me hundreds of years later and I get some things wrong, the fact that I'm in the conversation is still pretty good. And so I'm gonna say, like, it was where they were at.
yeah.
And they really were after, because look, they really believed this is a narrative that they're like, their teeth sink into this thing. This is real to them.
Mm,
And the degree to which, I mean, I think, okay, so you're more right than any of us want to admit, because one of the problems you hear now is, um like William James in Will to Believe, one of the things he says there is like, one of my first acts of free will be to believe.
mm,
um and especially when you talk about like a Christian narrative, there's the believe that you believe in order to see. So there's a kind of journey that we have to go on here in order to perceive rightly.
mm, mm,
And we can certainly go down that path, but I think you're correct in the assertion that by trying to say these are two different separate paths, is, to the degree that we believe that and buy into it, we sort of get like a Gnostic world where you get a set of propositions that, like, decontextualized. I mean, I don't know. It's like, how do we end up with spiritual fundamentalists or fundamental materialists?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I was in this conversation with the whoever handles the sentientist, their Twitter account was saying, well, there is no benevolent God if predation exists. And it got into this whole, it's like, oh man,
See,
this
I
is a
think,
deeply, like we're getting deeply theological here, and that's fine. But these arguments for me are like, man, they've been rehearsed and rehearsed so many times that
and they're mostly just a matter of talking about things from different levels.
yes, yeah,
When you talk about the benevolence of God, you cannot talk about it on the level of the predation of the species in a biological context unless you understand the way in which the biological context emerges from the benevolence of God. Like, until you really understand what agape means and what it means
mm-hmm.
to allow for something to be what it is, regardless of what it becomes, and create space for that thing still. And the way in which, like, oh, I'm going to go too many places. But the way in which you're talking about things at different levels, and when you talk about reality at this level, and then you try to apply it up here, it doesn't make any sense.
No, you're right. And you slid something in there that it's worth flagging for people who are interested, but like our culture is almost entirely obsessed with becoming. And
Hmm.
we have screwed being, like being what? No, no, no. We're interested in becoming. We're only
Hmm.
interested in becoming. It's like, well, you kind of need to know what you are in
Hmm.
order to know where you're headed here.
Well, it's like your point about the performative aspect of the person, that when all we think we are is the performer of our roles, when all we think we
mm,
are is the performer of our identities, we've already taken it as a presupposition that we know what the I is.
mm,
And
that's good. Yeah.
and you, like, when you really ask that question, and that was one of the most fundamental aspects that turned my entire world upside down, was I started to really ask that question, and not just in my not just in my kind of abstract theoretical space in my mind, but in like deeply existentially. I already had a fairly significant mindfulness practice at this point, so I was able to get, quite deeply beyond the space of my own stuff that's happening all the time. And I was like, I don't know. I don't, everywhere I turned, I found that I wasn't standing on solid ground. I'll say it that way.
Mm.
And so finally, all I had left was this word I. And I said, well, what is that? And I still don't know what it is, but I talk a lot about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of you can you can incorporate girls' insight, whether or not we're talking about specific like modal logic or axiomatic systems. You can just sort of take the idea and say, well, he's saying something that's true that probably cuts across all domains, which is there are some things that are true that you can't verify it from inside the system. So there are some things that, like, I mean, you think to like playing a video game, there are some things that you just have to accept as a given, because once you start questioning that, like, well, what am I? I mean, look, at what level of analysis are you?
Mhm.
You're a bunch of molecules, your atoms, your subatomic particles, your what's the even a harder problem, I think, is like not even a what am I, but like how am I?
Mm.
Because if you get down to the fundamental nature of what makes you you from just a strictly naturalistic point of view, you're a bunch of whirling, zooming subatomic particles that really you're not even that. You're really a probability field that, I turn my head and you don't exist to me. And I look back and there you are. Like, uh, okay, but there's something that it means to cohere over time. You know this from the earliest of ages, because the same person who puts their hand on the hot stove says ouch is the same person that 5 minutes later still feels it burning. Like
Hmm.
there is something that it means to cohere and be a
Hmm.
self.
Hmm.
And I think that that's when you talk about the existentialism and being grounded in that, there are Heideggerian philosophy has a lot to offer people. One of the things that I think I would recommend is that they read Buber
Hmm.
in relation to him, because he offers, look, the concept of thrownness. Oh man, for somebody like me, as soon as I read, I was like, "Oh, this is so deep. I love it. I'm really great." But the more you think about it, you're like, "Well, yeah, we are existentially. That's sort of the from the inside. The feeling of it is something like, how did I get here? Where
Hmm.
am I going? Who am I?"
Hmm.
But then Buber says, "Yeah, but that's because fundamentally Heidegger's project is monologic. It's
Hmm.
not dialogue." People are going to hate that I said this, but I'm just saying, like, it's worth reading that Buber's I thou perspective is that, yeah, you are thrown into existence, but you're also thrown, you don't, like, you can't acquire, every part of this is about relationship and
Hmm.
relating. You're
Hmm.
thrown into a family of some sort,
Hmm.
even if it's just a biological family. You are part of the human race. You are someone's offspring. You live in a particular county, state,
Hmm.
province, whatever. Like, and it scales all the way up, right? So there is something, there's not just one thing that it means to be human, for sure. There are, like, from different levels of analysis, you can come up with different answers, but you you really run into some hard limits
Hmm.
in, like, what you do, because again, you can't say a human being is someone who, without any alterations, can live with 300 beats a minute for 90 years. Like,
Hmm.
that isn't, I mean, maybe there's an isolated case somewhere. Maybe there's
Hmm.
a person who's sort of like got the idiot savant of hearts that can just beat like that for an unbelievable amount of time. But there are just some like finite limits here. And
Hmm.
if we don't see ourselves for what we are, then we start to lie to ourselves.
Hmm.
That's why a lot of these narratives are started running out of speed. Man, you cannot run on a lie but for so long before you have to start creating another lie to cover the fact that,
Yes.
like, you're getting caught in this.
Yes.
Um,
And
so
there's this way there where you have to have this radical, because to me, like what you're talking about there is this sense of like you can't. There's a way in which everything about what I am is a relationship, because like my sense of
fractal all the way up and down, man.
exactly, because there was a time for most of my life that I thought I actually made choices, and I often made choices that I was not proud of. I didn't. It's not like I went to prison or anything, but I was not
Right.
making them the optimal choices for my life. I sinned all the time, and um, whenever I say the word sin, I feel like I have to go through the definition of what I mean by it because it's so different. But um, once I stopped trying to be the one making the choices, and I started instead trying to pay attention to how I was relating
Hmm.
in and through the choice and before the choice, and the pattern that the patterns that manifested around the choices that I made. And instead of trying to control them, I just started trying to change the way in which I related to them. And almost like, I don't know, there's something bound up in this modal confusion thing, right? The difference between the being mode and the having mode. And this this sense of, even like you were talking about earlier with kind of these dialectics that emerge at different levels. And if I'm in the being mode, there's a way in which, even as we're talking right now, whether you say something that I really resonate with or something that is feels confusing to me, there's a way in which, if I'm grounded in the being mode, I just kind of watch it. And it's almost as if I kind of turn one way or the other, right? And it's like if I turn this way, it's like there's some tension here, or
Mm,
this way, and this really resonates. And there's a and so I relate to them in different fashions, but I don't need to grab them. And I don't need to grab my moments of my life. I don't need to grab on and say, I'm making this choice. But that instead, I can notice the moment. I can notice where I am, and I can change the like almost the posture of my attention in the moment. And that seems to be much more effective in actually shifting the overall trajectory and the decision making itself.
mm.
Because I think all these choices, they're so it's like the free will thing. It's like, well, where do you want to start to talk about free will?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
because there, like, every process is a fractal process that's embedded in another one, stretching back beyond anything we know and stretching forward beyond anything we know. So, like, sure, there seems to be some level of agency at which I can intervene in different processes, for sure. But, like, in the grand scheme of things, you know, well, did I go and drink because I just chose to, or was I thirsty and that manifested up from my cells through my brain and triggered a response mechanism that is so automatic that you almost can't stop it?
Yes, this is the famous Liggett experiments in the philosophy of mind. Um, Dr. Al Mealy is probably, arguably, he's the leading scholar in this area on on free will. And it is interesting to me that just an aside about the kind of moment that we're living in, that we're being deranged uh, by being gaslit into thinking that you can't have someone like Dr. Rosenberg, who as a brilliant thinker, philosopher, atheist, and Peter Van Inwagen, another brilliant philosopher, but who's a theist, a Christian. They're like best friends, and they will go round and round about these things. But there's something that's just like been hijacked in us to think that we can't disagree, or if we do, that means that there's something inherently wrong with the relationship. And just throwing that out there, that you know
I mean, that's
and it
Sartre, right? Like, doesn't that isn't that Sartre
um
where we get that? Like,
which part? Hell is
like
other people.
yeah, essentially,
Yeah,
right? Like that,
yeah,
like
yeah.
that, like that.
No exit.
Yeah, like if my being is my actual, like, projection of self from one moment into the next, and
Yeah,
my own creation of the value system, then because I am fully autonomous in a sense, my value system is becomes the value system by which others are judged. And because we're inherently relational, we cannot actually turn that off. We can't actually just, like there's this wild narrative that people talk about and seem to just, like, expect as a matter of course that someone can say something that, like, is diametrically opposed to everything I understand about the world, and I'm supposed to just pretend as if that doesn't exist. It's
yeah.
like, now, if I actually pay attention to it, I can allow for them to be in that space, but I can't pretend it's not there.
Right, right. Yeah, again, this is being able to perceive the thing for what it is. And for me, like, there's nothing that you could tell me, like, and I really mean this, and I think that this is something that amazes people in, just drawing from a therapeutic example again. You'll have people that you've seen months and months and months and months, and maybe they came in with, oh, I'm having a problem managing my performance at home, at work, etc. But then, after about a year of like working with this person, maybe then they can tell you the thing that's really, really
Mm,
bothering them. And
mm,
what happens in that moment is when they finally have, and you have, I mean, like, I'm not criticizing the build up process. Like, you have to have trust. Like, there's a
totally.
process to this. They need to feel supported in an environment where if they're going to spill the beans on the thing that's really got them there, the thing that they're secretly worried about is that you're going to be like everyone else, and that the truth that they're holding, when they tell you, you're going to fall apart right there in front of them. And then when you fall apart, it's going to confirm to them that the thing that they've been hiding, they were right to hide, because it is that bad and it's just
Mm.
world destroying. So
So
when
there's,
you
can I jump in there really fast?
yeah, yeah.
There's this way in which, so this is where I think agape plays. I think this is actually like the functional person to person manifestation of agape is the ability to be present with the worst part of someone else and look them in the eye and be there with them and not turn away. To have the courage to be there and truly be there and allow space. That is what provides people the courage to look at themselves.
And not just tell you the worst thing, but you have to tell them the worst thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the man, you can be made and unmade uh in a moment. Young men can become old in a day. I mean, like, there are these experiences, um and hearing some of your own story is why I was eager to have this conversation, because I've seen, end of life care, and sort of how all of this stuff plays itself out. I've seen precious few examples of where the person did not pull back. Because,
Mm.
dude, let's just put it on the table. This is hard. Like, um a voyage to India, a passage to India. Um there's this line in that novel where one of the characters dies, and whenever the emissary, whoever's delivering the message, when he tells the character, hey, this person died, in the novel it says it forever, no matter what they died of, the emissary was the person that killed him, for that character. Like, for all intents and
Mm.
purposes, they were the executioner. It's sort of predating some Schrodinger's cat
Totally,
here, where like they
totally.
were they were always alive until you
Mm-hmm.
told them they were dead. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the same way, in really profound way, for all of us, that
Mm-hmm.
like, the so I guess we can just sort of segue into this, like,
Yeah.
something that it does mean currently to be human is that, like, that it's finite in a physical realm, in the frame that you find yourself in right now. You will draw a final breath at some point,
Mm-hmm.
and someone will have to be the emissary and the executioner, and they'll tell you, and you will not believe them, because
Mm.
this is I it's not believable in some sense,
Totally.
because all of your life, and Becker makes this argument in Denial of Death, is like, okay, how can you not deny, like, how could you respond differently? Because if you're going to think in terms of evolution, think of what it meant in the process of an organism fighting to individuate and become itself over time, and how robust its defenses needed to be, and how hard it had to work to be a living thing, when there are far more, innumerable more entities and beings that will never exist than actually do exist or will
Mm.
exist. And
Mm.
so, to be one of the precious few of course that's going to be something that we don't want to think about. We
Mhm.
want to suppress, we want to project, we want to engage in guilty and shaming and all of these
Mhm.
things. But man, when you start that, that's just shadow all the way down.
Mhm.
And so,
That's the inherent unknowability.
yeah, and it is.
It
But
is like it is our portal to infinity. Like we don't have the ideas of infinity. I don't think if we don't have birth and death.
I don't even, if if there's a such thing as success in a conversation, which I don't think there is, other than having a good time doing it. But if I could convince your audience of one thing, it's that I don't even think so. I got in terms of bioethics, I got uh, mired in this conversation, and then I mentioned it to Karen that my sort of foray into the conversation in a professional philosophical sense on death, meaning of life, and whether or not the fact that we must die, whether it undercuts meaning.
Mm,
And I remember in this discussion, there's this wonderful, amazing scholars, and then there's me who's just like, oh man, you hit it so nail on the head when you were just talking about the baby that died,
mm,
and that you guys tried so heroically to bring this baby back.
mm,
And the moment the realization sets in for that mom that like she's not bringing this baby home alive, like there's a different, like, that sound is a portal to a different world, and that is the freaking truth. And I
mhm,
mean, like that portal, the place that takes you to is, it's the moment that you cannot tell the truth if you can't tell the truth in that moment. Like
mhm,
that sound is the truth, man. I mean, we think that
mm,
it's, again, we want to deny the fact that we are freaking animals. Like we're not only animals, but don't deny that we are. Like give me the credit of a wolf can freaking howl, man. At least
mhm,
allow me to keen over
mhm,
the death of my child. Like, I
mhm,
mean, it's the unimaginable. It's beyond the worst thing you could imagine, because imagining your child no longer existing is not, it's just, I don't know, it's like your whole mind and apparatus is like Teflon when it comes to that. Like it just cannot stick. It just,
yeah,
you can't allow that thought to take up residence
yeah.
and be sane, because the
And
world is inherently dangerous.
you see people. I mean, I've had friends who have lost children, and it like they to overcome that takes almost unimaginable grace. And even in so far as it is overcomable, those that there is a death that happens. You cannot talk about it with any other language in the parents that survive.
Oh,
There's a death that happens even within them. So,
yes, yes. And you, okay, yes. Let's just pause here for a moment then, because you know I'm trying to convince people we're not properly oriented towards death. We don't know what it means. We don't know how to deal with it, because we don't have our heroic system, the system and structures that exist for us in our current dilapidated, um, just flimsy, wispy kind of post-Christian, like the problem with living in a post-Christian era is that it's about as impotent as you can get. Like you can't, that society needs to be on spiritual, philosophical Viagra, Cialis, all of them combined, because you can't make yourself have the proper, you can't even make yourself have the affection for those things which you should value:
yeah.
truth, goodness, beauty. um and and John, um in his book on zombies as the predominant metaphor for our time, it's worth people reading, because even though it's an academic book and it sounds like, is this good? I mean, like, is this something I really want to read about zombies? Like, he makes a much more profound point about um, the receding of the sacred canopy that
Mhm.
that Christianity had provided, and I there's no way that our generation and younger are going to be able to be what philosophers of old taught, which is that philosophizing is sort of preparing for death.
Mhm.
We cannot be properly oriented as being towards death, because if we get a gray hair, if I get a wrinkle,
Mhm.
if God forbid that I put on weight, whatever it is, man, we're going to engage to the extent that it is possible for us to access a form of biotechnology,
Mhm.
and we'll engage in cosmetic biotechnology. I'm not judging that. What I'm saying is there's something that it means to, if I said, what's one of the most toxic substances on the planet? And you said, botulinum. And I said, put it right here. You'd say, what would make, what does that say about the culture? We
Mhm.
look back and we say, good God, those people of yesterday, they were so dumb.
Oof.
They put lead in their wigs. Who do you think they're going to look back on and be like, they put botulinum in their forehead? Like,
Yeah.
there's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Um,
And there's so I have a question for you. You, from your experience and drawing on both sides, your philosophical knowledge, your literature knowledge, and your personal existential reality and narrative. This question of death and and there and death and the sacred,
hmm.
and what is it about our orientation towards death as a culture now, and how does that pull us in from or in a direction of the sacred versus something that is more um, what maybe aligned for human flourishing.
Yeah, that's about as a deep a question as you can ask. So let's take, this is great. I mean, this is just what I live for. Um,
And I'm
let's
I'm someone who I have absolutely no fear, which is why I talk about the kinds of things I do, because I just don't care if I'm wrong, because I don't think I'm right about anything. And so I that's why I go as I go the way I do. But so please, that's my setup for you. Uninhibited.
okay. It's gonna be, yeah. So the first step is this. Okay, so the scholars that I told you, like, they're debating back and forth about what what it means to die, and what it means to live, and what the meaning of meaning is. And okay, and so I come in with a very applied bioethics perspective, which means I'm saying to the philosophers, I noticed that in your sample and in your findings that you actually spent no time with anyone who was actually suffering, who
Mm,
died, and their families who experienced the aftermath of that. So
really?
yeah, I mean, of course, there are some who will have like gone to morgues and spent thousands of hours doing that thanatology.
But
But I'm just,
they're not sitting by the bedside of someone as they're dying.
oh, come on, man, no way, are you kidding me?
Really?
That's way too
Really?
close to the truth, man. That's my point. Is so here was the
Wow, that
criticism.
shocks me. Okay,
It
yeah,
should
sorry, I
shock
gotta
you.
get over that for a second.
No, you should be shocked.
That
I was shocked. I was like, what are y'all talking about? I was like, I noticed that you didn't sample. I'm an N of one here. And the pushback that you gave me, this is honest to God what they said. They were like, Kyle, look. Everything that you're saying, like, you're you're philosophizing about death and meaning and life. And I was like, yes, isn't that what we're doing? And they're like, no, we're philosophizing about the philosophy of meaning and life and death. And I was
is
like, so
literally
you're
the
even you're like further removed from the actual
you're
quisi mi
abstracted.
veritas. Yeah,
You
like what's the truth? Pilate's question, like
yeah.
what is truth? Truth is that woman keening. She's telling you the truth. What's the truth? It's like it hurts in a way that you can't even put words to it. It's so like suffering will it is an existential truth serum. You're going to tell the truth whether you lie about everything else, whether you lie to yourself, and we all do in ways that we know, in ways that we don't know. We
Mm-hmm.
lie to our spouses, we lie to our society.
Mm.
We're all engaged in our sort of immortality projects, but at the end of the day there is a kind of truth serum that hits you when someone walks in the room and says, we're preparing XYZ. Why? And because you could die. I mean, I just remember the look on my wife's face when this nurse comes in and she's like, okay, I'm just preparing. There's gonna be a lot of people running around. They're gonna be doing things and hanging bags and my wife is just like sort of stunned. She's like, wait, what are you saying? Because you have this idea that like everything's gonna play out and you're going to get to review. What is death? Death is like a panorama where you're sitting there and you're reviewing your whole life and it flashes before your eyes. Man, that's like maybe point some odd percent of all people who die have the luxury of like getting a kind of life review. I mean, this is just it's that's not the way that it typically happens because things happen so fast.
Mm.
Like and maybe you're in the hospital for a while. Maybe you broke your hip and you got surgery and you're on a swing bed. So you've lived 80 years and it took 80 years to get to the summit here. But to get to the nadir is like maybe, a couple weeks of
Mm-hmm.
being prostrate in that bed at that age, and it's
Mm-hmm.
almost a death sentence.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't necessarily unfold the way that you think it will. That's one
Mm.
of the lies that we tell to ourselves, right? Is that I'm in control of the way this is going to play out. Your quote about like the undecidability and the unknowability. This is why I think Nassim Taleb is wrong that like no, the true black swan event is not, it's not a pandemic, it's not a market crash. Existence is the black swan. All
Mm.
of this is
Mm.
like it, you had no way of knowing moment to moment what the heck's
Mm.
going to happen to you.
The now.
And yes, it's just all you can know. And I remember like when this was dawning on me, man, people in everyday society absolutely hate me because like I don't mean, it's not like I go around doing this on purpose, but I remember um when I was a young doctoral student and I was married and we needed money to live and working 70 hours a week researching and teaching, like it doesn't pay you very much. And so I just remember I was in this interview, I was called in and they're sitting there and they're like, they're asking me standard interview questions, but there's one that was like, if you could hear like the sound of the computer going like neener, neener, like and shutting down. It's like when they asked me, they were like, so where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I just kind of like, I was like, uh-oh. And I had to make a decision on this. I was like, do I tell the truth
Mm.
or do I tell them what they want to hear?
Mm.
And so I opted for both. And I said, so like, if I understand your question, one of the things that, if I'm hearing you right, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you want to know about the investment you're making in me. You
Mhm,
want to know if I'm going to allow you to invest all of this time, effort, and money in me as a candidate only to have me walk. So
mhm,
you want to know my 5 year plan. And what I'm trying to tell you is you don't know your 5 year plan. You know
mhm,
what your strategic plan says, but you don't know if you'll be here to execute it. That's the
mhm,
problem. It's not that we have plans. Please, no one mistake what I'm saying. I'm saying you plan all you want. Plan, oh man, but futurity, that's not a gift that's given to us.
mhm.
Like the Greeks, they had this all the way back, man. Phaedrus.
And
It, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, and the to take it one step further, the good news is you don't want to know. You don't want to have control. Like you can plan all you want. You can have the best 5 year plan. You can have the best 10 year plan. You can have the best life plan. And it's not what you want because that's the thing about life. It's dynamic. And that's why the now is so important, is because I can make my plans. And even if I can, even if I'm really like, if I'm really bright and I'm really on top of it and I'm really hardworking and disciplined, I increase my odds of actualizing it. But they're like, especially the longer term the plan is, those odds decrease dramatically because you never know. And you will miss the more dedicated you are to your specific plan, you will miss opportunities because you have your blinders on and you will miss opportunities. That doesn't mean you don't have a plan, and that doesn't mean you aren't disciplined in the pursuit of it. But it means you hold it very, very loosely. You don't even hold it. You set that thing off like a hot air balloon and you watch it fly away. Because maybe, just maybe, you'll glimpse a star beside that balloon and you can go for that instead. And that's an awful lot cooler.
But see, the, and there are certainly political, economic, sociological, economic strong incentives to trying to persuade people that the opposite of what you just said is true.
Hmm.
Again, that's the focus on becoming and doing rather than being.
Hmm.
And so, for me, just suddenly being ripped out of society. I was,
Hmm.
out of circulation for years, completely in isolation. And I mean, you're just, man, you fall into an abyss that feels like eternity
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
unmitigated, uninterrupted suffering.
Hmm.
You, man, you do some traveling
Hmm.
and you, through that, I mean, it is when I talk about this kind of suffering and existential suffering and pain, it's like, man, there's a couple ways you can deal with this. It's either you learn to bend, you break, you medicate yourself into oblivion, and maybe that helps, maybe it doesn't help. Maybe it helps in one way and really hurts you in another.
Hmm.
And and then there's, again, and I'm very libertarian, and like however you choose to like navigate that path, far be it from me to tell someone who's in a state of extreme deprivation what is best for their body at that moment in time. Like there's no
You
way I could know that. There's
your
no way I
journey
could know
with the
that.
truth serum is your journey.
Yes, it's like
Yeah.
a psychedelic, man. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't know what's going to happen, but you're going to get ontological shock. That's for dang sure. because it's
Mm,
not what you thought it was going to be. I mean,
mm.
like I had worked my whole life to be such a perfectionist in all of these different domains. Like I was a straight A student, I was a college athlete, and the six pack, like beautiful, significant other. My life was just like it was going to be up and up and up and up, and I'm gonna finish my grad work at Oxford, and I'm going to be this rock star scholar, and then you know what, I was like being spoon fed by my parents and couldn't speak and couldn't walk and
And you
I
did
you,
nothing wrong. Like you didn't make a choice that was foolish that threw you off of your path. You were actualizing properly. And
yeah, I mean, time and chance happen to us all. Like
exactly.
there's and the thing is, like, it happened to me younger. But here's the problem: we are fundamentally blind. We're existentially blind to the reality. That's my point about us not even being oriented properly
Mm,
beings toward
hmm
death, because we've got ourselves convinced that we'll see it coming. We'll see
hmm
the deer dart out in front of us on the road in the middle of the night and we'll dodge it. Okay, fair enough. Let's let you play that for a little while. Um, Eventually, though, given enough opportunities, because in life as in death, you need on a given day, like, man, I think it's something like 500 trillion. Your body produces something. Someone fact check me on this, but Mr. Producer, because I think
Jamie,
it's
can you pull
five.
that up?
Yeah, like 500 trillion um, molecules of hemoglobin per second. That's to
Mm,
keep you at stasis. That's not like you're not a superhuman combat soldier that they're giving nanotechnology to replace some of your red blood cells, carry that oxygen. We're just talking about like, this is what I need moment to moment to stay alive. Man, that is freaking ridiculous when you talk about what
which,
the body does
yeah,
second to second.
as a side note, we are very impressed with our abilities to make machines. And man, oftentimes we are far too impressed because for exactly the reasons you're saying, that the level of complexity, the level of intricacy, don't even throw the autopoetic aspect, right? You just say, just say this thing is just running. It's still unbelievable, like so unbelievable you can't even begin to shake a stick at it. And then you throw on the fact that, like, you know, my wife's pregnant right now. And, you know, when you really start to think about what happens in the birth of a child and the growth of a child inside a woman's body, it is insane. You have one cell that turns into this on its
Preach,
own.
preach,
Like,
preach.
like
And
that's
again, it's bi-directional. My wife and I talk about this all the time. Is like, okay, the acorn, you can grow a mighty oak from the acorn. The instructions are inherently there. The the platonic form, it's there. It knows somehow. There's an intuitive knowing. There's some vast amount of computation in there that if you were able to explore it, you'd know that it's probably on the order of computationally about as complex as us, like,
Mhm.
and the things that it does. That's why when we look at the weather, you're like, the weather, it's kind of doing its own thing. It's got a mind of its own. Yeah, because it's about computationally equivalent with us. So it's like when you're trying to evaluate something that's computationally more complex or extravagant than you, it often looks like it's about on par. Like there's a there's a kind of event horizon which I can't see beyond that complexity, or I can't compute that, especially not given the finite time in my life.
Mhm.
But like, think of the baby as like, okay, you got one cell of each, and it's like, boom, they come together. It's one thing for that to know what to do with itself. for
Mm-hmm.
the sets of instructions, but then for it to also reprogram a woman's body
Mm-hmm.
without her doing, like, she's not making a choice on like there's some thermodynamics involved. Obviously, if you take in more calories and all that, you're going to put on weight. But I mean, like, this time around with my wife, she's not listening. No, like within 2 weeks, like her body was already changing. And I
Mm-hmm.
was just
Mm-hmm.
like, man, this is it's incredible. And I know
Mm-hmm.
what people will say is like, we are falling in love with just like knowing the phenomenon doesn't mean that you can't still conceive of it as being sublime or have awe. And
Mm-hmm.
that's true. But I think we're saying something deeper here is that, I mean, just what it means to live and to die, like it's fundamentally like undecidable. You
Mm-hmm.
don't know, you have no memory of existence so far as we know before you were born. You come into the world, and this is Plato's one of his main arguments is that you spend the rest of your life trying to remember.
Mm-hmm.
You try to remember what you forgot when you're up there in the noumenal world observing what the gods were up to. And you got
Mm-hmm.
some glimpse of that. And there are different castes of souls. And I don't mean it like caste, caste, but like dispositions. So
Mm-hmm.
the philosophical soul somehow just turns out to be the one closest to the gods. They're going to get to linger up there a little bit longer. But even so, in the myth that he talks about, this the myth of this charioteer, you got a good horse and like a white horse and a dark horse, and they're like pulling against you, pulling your soul back down. And so this is the reason he could go up to a slave and the slave could solve a
Mm-hmm.
Pythagorean theorem for him. It's about like, oh, you already had the knowledge, you lost it. Going back to this like encyclopedic, you lost it when you fell here. And part of dialectic is about, this is why we need each other so much, is like, I can't know everything I'm supposed to know, I can't experience everything I'm supposed to experience without you. This is one reason why I suggest that the Platonic Socrates was so against writing.
Mm-hmm.
Is he says in Gorgias, I think, is what happens to the soul, like once when you're reading something, you don't have the author there with you
Mm-hmm.
to critique you for reading it incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
So you leave. Oh, he has a great quote here. I'm going to mess it up, but he says something like, you leave with a semblance of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Like you think you got out of it what you were supposed to,
Mm-hmm.
but you have no way of knowing that without the other. You need the other there to
So
like
this,
actually like help you get to where your soul needs to get.
so I've been thinking this the whole time you're talking. That's beautiful. That is so beautiful. And I think it for me that is this. There's a few different aspects of it. Well, on one level, it's the tyranny of the propositional over the
Yes.
participatory,
Ooh. Ooh, good.
because the participatory comes first, and then the procedural, and then the perspectival, and then the procedural, and then the propositional. And it is that way, and it is ontologically that way, because the the autopoetic system exists before the abstract propositional,
Mm,
right? In the progression of being, the you know the proposition is always dependent upon the lower order structures. And to the degree that it tries to contain the lower structures, thereby it limits reality. It inverts the pyramid, right?
mm,
If you imagine the hierarchy of being and the propositional, the the ability to know being, the ability to be in connectedness to the thing in itself, in proper relationship to, is a hierarchy that is like this. And when you make the propositional the fundamental level of reality, when you philosophize about philosophy, right? You literally create this as now your foundation. And because it's only this big, it can only pick up different aspects of these ones below it, right? But then it has to try, and then it's trying to build on top of those. And all of this starts to fall away. And then all of this is a lie. And this is the
Yes.
Tower of Babel. This is the Tower of
Yes.
Babel versus Mount Analog.
This is absolutely, man, this is wonderful, beautiful. Like man, I can't even, like, so well said. I'm like, I'm blown away because this is exactly where I was going by saying we just fundamentally aren't oriented properly. And I was trying to like game this out and try to think of a way that I could describe it the way that I sort of see it. Um, and there's like concrete empirical examples I'll give, but it, just for a moment, because I've been thinking about it that same way, but I thought about it from, I hate Photoshop. Absolutely do not like it. It's just a program I don't like to use. My wife is a whiz at it. It's not that I don't like all of the programs. I like Illustrator. That's the one that I like to use. In in watching people who are very skilled use Photoshop, for the audience, like, I'm sorry, I can't, I'll try to give a different way of describing it, but it's just something that I'm working on, so I don't have the right language for it yet. But when you open up a project, let's say you're going to uh, make a flyer or something for an event, and someone says, well, these are kind of the schematics we want, and they send it to you and they're like, edit this for me. And you get in, you open the program, and there's the existing original document. Let's substitute truth there for a moment. Foundational level truth. One of the first things that someone who's skilled at it will do, they'll either push, depending on if they have an Apple or another computer PC, they'll hit like Command J. And what it does is like, it completely copies the original document, the original
Mm-hmm.
item, but it creates a new layer.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're naming it, people just name it like working layer or something like that. And the idea there is that if you create an exact copy and put it on top, all of the changes that you make will be on that layer, but not beneath. And so if you make a mistake or you erase something you're not supposed to, you can go back and edit that out without having destroyed the original. And this can go on, the more intricate the project is, this thing could go on for days or weeks or months. And there can be so many layers that if a person tried to send you that with all of the layers open the way that they are while they're working, man, it might crash your computer. There'd just be so much data in there. So what do? They compress it into one layer. And here's the problem. That's kind of where we're at right now, right? Is like somebody hit Control J and then they started doing editing. All of our technology, and it like, it's an adjustment layer that has it's like literally inserted itself between us and the foundational layer of truth. And we're so far removed from it. We're so many layers above that that we don't even realize the extent to which we're not touching foundational truth. And so I wish, I mean, there's a linguistic way we can talk about it. Like if you go back to Genesis and you're thinking about what happens in Adam and Eve's experience there, there's obviously lots of different interpretations, but I'm just trying to think in this way for a moment. But the first John likes to talk about a psychotechnology. In comms, we would call it a biotechnology. That language itself it originates from the brain. It's body based, brain based, and so it's a techne. It's a technology, and so it's a biotechnology because it comes from us. And so one of the first biotechnologies is language, and it's used almost immediately for subversion.
Mm-hmm.
God says to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
mankind, like, hey,
Which, which
everything
is the
here.
which is the first Control J. Like,
Oh, okay. Say that. Go
can I
there.
play with you? Because I love
Yeah,
this
no,
metaphor.
go for
So
it. That's good.
so like there's a way in which there's a reason that you press Control J. And the reason is that you're attempting to manipulate the thing into being a certain way that is other than it is.
Mm,
And this is this is to commit the knowledge of good and evil, right? So when you press Control J on your map of reality, right? Because like this layers, right? Like you can be in touch with the thing in itself. But the only way that you can do that is if you've never hit Control J. If you're playing in the space where you're not trying to hold on to a frame of reality.
oh,
But
that's good.
as soon as you hit Control J, you're doing it because now I'm the one painting the picture, right? And so because I want my reality to be just a little bit different than it is, because I know it's better. So I want this to be this way. And so Control J, now I can edit, right? Now I can edit. Now I have a map in my head that I can edit. But my map is no longer the territory.
Dude, and the thing is, it's like at a civilizational level, we just left the computer unattended, and God only knows how many people have come in and done like additional layers, adjustment layers where things are getting adjusted. And so it is hard to sort of renegotiate like how do we get back to that foundational layer. And so when you think about just from a linguistic point of view, and so for people that don't use Photoshop, um, if you read the narrative in Genesis, so one of the interesting things that happens is, God says, okay, first of all, I don't know why everybody starts with the fall. That's not where the story starts. It's not where Christianity starts. It's not where Judaism starts. It's not with the fall. It's with, it's good. This
Mm-hmm,
is
mm-hmm.
good. And look, you can't get to perfection unless you're in the category of good. We've got it inverted that like we're trying to perfect ourselves. You can't perfect anything unless it's first good. Like that's the first categorical place we need to get to is becoming good.
There's a way in which the idea of total depravity and the idea of original fit sin as being some kind of full disconnection from God is one of the deepest shackles that binds Christianity.
Mm,
Because because exactly what you're saying, the fall to Christ, fall through Christ is an arc. It's a story arc. It's an arc of existence and time, but it's not the whole picture. It's not the whole picture. And like at least in my upbringing in the in the Protestant and I do not mean this in a derogatory way because I am deeply appreciative of what my upbringing was, and also my time in the evangelical churches. But I never had this sense, and I'm not saying everyone has this, but for me, in my experience of it, I never had this sense that there was that I was doing anything other than just kind of like skating by through this life until I could die and go to heaven.
mm,
Because in this deep Gnostic kind of way, the material was fallen. It's all, this is that we are just pilgrims here, right? Like
yeah.
we're all passing to our home and all this kind of axial dualistic, like we're all gonna go to heaven and but at the end of the day, that's not Christianity. You cannot You cannot abide by the axioms that underlie the Christian story. You cannot have the Christian ontology. And this is why it's eroded fundamentally, is that the Christian ontology does not work with that being the primary arc of history. You cannot have one God. And Christ cannot be what the claims are that he actually is if there's no good first and good after.